Hey friends, welcome to another episode, I think episode 4 of this podcast, and we're grateful to have you joining us for more conversation around our sermon series, working our way through the Gospel of Luke. We know some of you are watching online, some of you are listening in your cars and not watching in the cars, which is great, but we really just, again, want to say thanks for joining us, and thanks for taking the conversation around our Sunday sermon material into your week, because that's really, at the end of the day, what our goal is that this would in some way encourage you and help you and remind us together to carry these conversations forward with our families, with our friends, and even into small groups and other places in our week. So welcome, super glad to have you. This is like an all online, all digital week. We were entirely online on Sunday, pre-recorded that service.
Yeah, for those who were watching, there's a few of you that didn't know that we had the foresight to plan in advance and record that Saturday morning, and so Grant had to stay on his toes a little bit and be extra ready. But you were
Saturday morning, extra ready Saturday morning. Yeah. That was, you know what? It was a good throwback to a season that none of us are eager to remember. But I was really grateful for everybody who came together and did that well, and jumped in from our tech teams to yourself in music, LNA doing a family ministry section of the service. If you haven't watched it, we'd encourage you to go and watch the full service, and there's some activities for your kiddos, grandkids, really to try to help all of us worship at home. So today we're jumping into a conversation based on the end of Luke 4, and we're going to talk about a lot of things like the year of Jubilee and justice, the gospel, all of it relating together today. Pushing us, I think, to live a little bit differently. So, Justin, thanks for throwing some questions my way.
I've got some doozies today. So, okay. So the first question I want to ask, I mean, this passage is so, I feel like it's iconic. It's an iconic passage where Jesus enters ministry in this significant way, goes to his hometown, and he does like a kind of a mic drop moment where he, preaches from, reads from this scroll in Isaiah, a few different spots in Isaiah, I think, and kind of chaos ensues. It's great. Yeah. But in this passage he reads from Isaiah, he touches on a lot of kind of touchy issues within Judaism, and even for us today, as we look for what the gospel is and for what the good news of Jesus's arrival and his coming is. Right. So, you pose the question about what the gospel is, and kind of wondering, like, if you were, like an elevator pitch, someone's, asking you to define the gospel in 60 seconds. So I pretend I'm a non-Christian, and you are going to give me an elevator pitch, 60 seconds. I might even time you, and then cut you off at 60 seconds. Tell me what the gospel is.
Yeah, great question. I should have figured you would start with this question. So having not thought about it, which is wonderful.
Okay, when does the timer start? Right now?
Right now.
Okay,
you can
go.
Start it now. The gospel to me is the good news, and I think that's an important word, the good news about Jesus's life, including all of his teaching, his death, and his resurrection. So Jesus's entire life, from start all the way beyond his death into his resurrection, brings good news, brings the gospel into the world. This is the kingdom of God breaking in. This is life the way it was intended to be. This is brokenness being healed. This is sin and death being defeated. This is life. This is life abundant. And I think I referenced John 10:10, where Jesus says, I have come so that they may have
15
life.
15 seconds.
And that life impacts you as an individual. and that life impacts you into, we believe, eternity, and that life impacts you in the way you live your life toward others.
Nailed it. Timer.
So the piece for me is that in 60 seconds, you're not going to convince somebody
No.
of, sin and death and brokenness in their own life, and you need to be restored and healed and forgiven and experience grace. All of things that we believe are like theologically true. The 60-second picture for me is Jesus says, like, I have come so that they may have life.
Yeah.
And have it to the full. And then we're going to get into that, where he talks about release for the captives, and that's an important word, where the poor are being lifted out of poverty, where the sick are being healed out of their disease, where we see that brokenness being mended and healed, and all of Jesus's life. I definitely fall into that camp. So I think there are two camps, predominantly two camps. When you start thinking, okay, what is the gospel? One camp will say very clearly, this is the message concerning Jesus's death and resurrection and how it impacts us as human beings in our sinful state, living out of and into brokenness, and then being lifted out of that. So however we want to talk about redemption of sin is sort of the box that would be the gospel. I think there's another way of understanding it, and this is where I lean, which, as I said, is yes, it has to begin and end with the death and resurrection of Jesus. That to me is like, that's the foundation of Christianity. However, the only way to understand that is by looking at all of Jesus's teaching. And the gospel, the good news, according to the writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, well, they don't say, we're going to tell you a story so that you can understand the gospel, but we'll get to the gospel. The gospel is about Jesus' death and resurrection. They say, here's the good news. Here's the gospel. The gospel of, and it begins with the entirety of Jesus' life. So all of his teachings, the way in which followers of Jesus are challenged to live, all of that is the gospel. And so, when I say, and I think I've said this, like, Christians can be really good at compartmentalization. So, we have our church life and our home life and our work life and these friends and those friends, and let's not meet those friends together. That's really awkward. Like, what I think Jesus challenges us toward is, no, if the gospel is just this theological reality, assent, thought, concept, theory, equation, whatever you want to call it, if it's that, then it becomes easier to compartmentalize our lives. But if it's all of what Jesus calls his disciples into, as he teaches and challenges them and calls them to be like him and to start trying these things, like you start doing the same things. Like you can start healing, you can start, reaching down and help, lifting people up. And the disciples fail multiple times. It's wonderful. They wrestle with it. They succeed at certain points and then fail again. Like, it is really a great narrative. All of that is what Jesus is challenging us to see, I think, as the gospel. And that's not my thought. Like, this isn't, new thought at all to me. There are lots of people would fall into, these camps on sort of these two sides of the gospel coin.
However, though, like, there is almost like a bit of a remnant of Sunday school, Sunday school theology that sticks with us. That is like, it's true, but it's perhaps a little truncated in terms of the wholeness and the fullness of what the gospel is. And for good reason, that kids can only comprehend so many things, right? But I think as we seek to grow and mature, we should grow in our understanding of the fullness of the gospel, which I appreciate your little 60-second pitch there, because I do think it is valuable to be able to articulate and touch on these important pieces of the gospel, that it's not just reduced to you suck, God saved you through Jesus on the cross. Done. You know, like
now go and live the same life differently somehow, right?
Yeah. Like it doesn't instill in me a lot of hope for my life and for
Yeah, and we talk about this, I think fairly often. But another way to think about it, just really briefly, is that the Christian life the Christian hope isn't just that you go to heaven when you die.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes some of the reduction, is that it's entirely only about salvation toward eternal life, as opposed to heaven breaking into earth here and now, and are living into eternal realities today and into eternity. It's this both and tension. And so I think it's easier to say, okay, it's that. Maybe an easier picture, maybe doesn't demand as much of us.
Yeah.
So to that extent, maybe it's a little bit easier. I think a fuller picture of the gospel is a lot more challenging, because it means that, yes, there's forgiveness for sins, and yes, there's grace and there's mercy and abundance of those things. And that demands something very, very different of our lives today, and not just into eternity, because it's not about me and it's not about you. It's about so much more than that.
Just the thought of that one hymn, The Wondrous Cross, that last line of I think the final stanza is, love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. You know, and I think that's a great way to encapsulate not just a response to the gospel, but a part of the gospel itself. And I think that's what you were getting at, that there is something central about the fact that Jesus is announcing the gospel before he has died and been raised. There's something I find very beautiful and comforting about that in a way.
Yeah, and there's symbolism in 4, right? In chapter 4, where Jesus escapes death.
Right.
So there's this foreshadowing of, Jesus not escaping death ultimately on the cross, but walking through it. And so, I think there's even already in chapter 4, we're getting hints of where Jesus's life will lead. But yeah, I think you're right. The picture of the gospel that we're given from the very beginning of Jesus's ministry is that it's here and now, and it arrives with Jesus's life, and moves through his death and into his resurrection and continues toward eternal life.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's not saying get ready, like the gospel's going to be here. He's saying, no, it's now.
Yeah.
Release for the captives, and
that it's going to have a real life impact in the here and now, which is, what he goes on to describe when he talks about the year of the Lord's favor. And another word that's used to describe that in the Hebrew scriptures is Jubilee. And this concept that there will be, like every 50 years, there is this like releasing of the land. There is to lay fallow, to be able to heal and grow, for a year of rest, for the releasing of captives, of slaves, the voiding of debts. Like there is really no modern category for this sort of thing, right? And yet I've always been struck by it and wondering, what is that? What does this look like? What did this look like for them? And then B, what does this look like for us today? Like, what could a life of Jubilee, a life of the year of the Lord's favor look like in 2025?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. We could spend probably a couple hours of multiple, single episodes on just entirely devoted to the year of Jubilee. And actually, one of the places I found myself this week was listening again to Tim Mackey from the Bible Project has a 50-minute podcast episode entirely devoted to the year of Jubilee. And so maybe we can link that in our
that's a good
video,
idea.
because they go into great depths on it. And the imagery around year of Jubilee is so significant. We're going to like scratch the surface here. But I think it is important. So if you want to read about the year of Jubilee, it's Leviticus 25. And it is like this idea of super Sabbath. So it's like the Sabbath of all Sabbaths. So if you go all the way back to the beginning, which I think when I do this as a preacher on a Sunday, they get a little nervous. Like, you got to go back to the beginning. Genesis 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So we're going all the way back because that just means it's going to be a long sermon. But the imagery that we get in the creation of the universe, the creation of the world, creation of humanity, regardless of how you choose to read that story, as literal 7-day creation, literal one Adam, one Eve, or whether you read that as poetry, as song, as art, describing realities that are true, but in less literal ways. Like no matter how you come at that, which again, that's its own episode. Yeah. No matter how you come at Genesis 1, the imagery, the truth that language is giving us is of God creating order out of chaos, bringing life where there was no life. And the creation in those first days culminate with a Sabbath day, a day of rest. Sabbath means to cease. Shabbat, you cease, you stop laboring, you stop working. You slow down and you just be. It's about resting. I like, and I'm not going to remember. I think it's Eugene Peterson who said that Sabbath is a day to pray and play. That's how he describes Sabbath. And I'm pretty sure it's Eugene Peterson, and we can correct ourselves after if I find that it's not, or people can fact check it. But I love that language. It's a day to pray and play. It's a day to align our hearts toward God wholly and solely as individuals, as families. You slow down, stop. So again, Sabbath could be its whole own episode, which maybe we'll do. But the creation narrative gives Israel, the people of God, this anchor point where they are called to live into that same rhythm of working for 6 days and Sabbathing, stopping, ceasing on the seventh. And then if you jump forward, the second image that I think is important to note is the freedom that the Israelites are given out of slavery in Egypt. So deliverance out of slavery by God in Egypt and toward the promised land. And so we've got creation, resting, God ceasing. There's an image around stopping, and then there's an image around release, deliverance, freedom from captivity. That then is moved forward. And in Leviticus, there's these commands towards Sabbath, not only Sabbath days, but Sabbath years. And so the seventh year for the people of Israel was meant to be an entire Sabbath year. So 6 years on working, laboring, buying and selling land. There's the farming that happens. There's a lot of production. There's storing away, and then the seventh year is a year of rest. And so in 25, there's again these commandments that are given to Moses. It says on Mount Sinai, the Lord says to him, "Give the following instructions to the people." So this is like in preparation for them to enter into the promised land. And the seventh year, so I'm just going to read a couple verses. It says, "Do not plant your fields or prune your vineyards during that year, and don't store away the crops that grow on their own, or gather the grapes from the unpruned vines. The land must have a year of complete rest. But you may eat whatever the land produces on its own during its Sabbath."
There's almost like an act of faith there that the land will provide enough, even as it lays rest.
Yeah, and one of the things that in the Bible Project podcast that I absolutely cannot take credit for is that they point back to is it's almost similar in some way to the manna being provided by God, and so there's you can store away. Don't store away. You store away enough for just the day,
overnight.
right?
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So it is. It's reliance on God, and it's reliance on God in this very specific way to just eat what the land produces on its own. It'll continue producing enough. What is enough, and you will have what you need. Again, just to jump forward quickly, like I think it points us even to Jesus' prayer: "Give us today what we need for today. Give us this day our daily bread." Is that same prayer? Give us what we need just for today. And so we have creation, Sabbath. We have release from captivity in Egypt, Sabbath. We have a Sabbath year, and then we have the year of Jubilee, which is a super Sabbath every 50 years. So every 7 cycles of Sabbath years, there's an additional Sabbath year. So we've got 7 times 7, 49. That 49th year would itself be a Sabbath year already, and then it starts on it starts again another, and there's not confused, but the debate about it doesn't start exactly on, like, it's not 2 full years, probably it's a year and a half. But so you have the 49th year, which would have been itself a Sabbath year where everything is resting, and then you've got like the super Sabbath year, which is the 50th year, and probably would have then meant like a year and a half or so, like 18 months of full Sabbath stop. And that's where we get these extra in 25, the year of Jubilee. In addition, it says count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 sets of 7 years, adding up to 49 years in all. Then on the Day of Atonement, and this is it, in the 50th year, blow the ram's horn loud and long throughout the land. Set this year apart as holy, a time to proclaim freedom throughout the land for all who live there. It will be a Jubilee year. And that word Jubilee, so that's a year of release. It is a year where, like you've said, the land continues to lie and just produce on its own. You're not farming. You're not storing away. It is a year where everybody returns to their home land, designated lands, which would have been set out according to the 12 tribes of Israel. It is a year where slaves are released, where debts can be forgiven,
which would have been connected, I guess, because a lot of them were indebted in slavery because they were indebted. So
indebted slave. Yeah, absolutely. And a year where there's other, sellers of land, don't take advantage of each other. When you make an agreement with your neighbor to buy or sell property, you must not take advantage of them. When you buy land from your neighbor, the price you pay must be based on the number of years since the last Jubilee. So it's this big reset. Yeah. It's this massive shift in the way we would, I think it's so hard for us to understand. It probably would have happened once a year, or not once a year, once a lifetime. If it's, the 50th year, and a whole lot, all of their economy is scheduled around this year of Jubilee, this year of release, of freedom, of setting free, and of just being and resting and stopping and allowing the land to produce what it does and not produce what it doesn't, and rely on God for enough in the midst of it.
So what would the hearers, as Jesus is reading from Isaiah, what would the hearers in Jesus's hometown have understood Jesus to be saying?
So I have a hard time putting myself in their shoes. I think there's debate whether the year of Jubilee actually happened.
Yeah.
So we were talking about this ahead of recording a little bit. Like I don't know, and admittedly, I didn't spend too much time trying to figure out where it comes up in the Old Testament and I think where it does come up, it's not observed. So debate whether it happened, B, what that would have looked like. I think when it was that in particular, the word release is a word that from Leviticus on is picked up by the prophets. And so that's why we see Jesus quoting from Isaiah 61. I would imagine that is what the people of Israel would have grabbed onto, is that quote, more from the prophets as pointing toward Messiah coming and arriving and proclaiming Jubilee in that context, as opposed to just declaring, oh, there's a year of Jubilee, but it's the wrong year. We were expecting it to come in 8 more years, like whenever that would have fallen.
Yeah.
I think it has more prophetic, messianic, eschatological implications than necessarily just immediately, oh no, we all have to sell our land. I don't think that's probably what they would have immediately heard.
I also wonder if, again, this is a people under the thumb of Roman rule. They don't, I am sure, even if they had been faithfully practicing Jubilee, they were under not their own economy, right? They were under someone else's economy. And so they were not able to, they wouldn't have been able to practice Jubilee.
They couldn't.
Yeah, they couldn't. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And so this, I could imagine for those who have this in their framework, and I think most of them would, I could imagine it would be appealing, but also like quite subversive and shocking in a way, which explains their response in some ways to what Jesus says.
Yeah, their response, I think, is initially, we talked a little bit about this, but it says that they're amazed with what he's saying, and that word is not always necessarily a good word. It's not necessarily a positive thing in the New Testament. When people are amazed, usually that happens because they think they understand what's about to happen, and then Jesus says, "Not quite." So I think you're right. They in all likelihood would have been hearing Jesus say, "Hey, get ready. We're going to throw off our captors. We're going to throw off the oppressive rule. We are the ones who are oppressed, and we are the ones who are waiting for deliverance. And if Jesus is the Messiah, then we're the ones who are going to be set free." And so then when Jesus reinterprets those words through the lens of Elijah and Elisha reaching out to people who were distinctly in Jewish theology, like unclean outsiders, that's when they turn angry. Because I think they would have seen Jesus, heard Jesus' words and thought, great, we're game on, like we're in, because we're the ones who are going to be set free. And Jesus immediately says, and it's so much bigger than, this is so much bigger than you could have imagined. And it's going to change the way you act beyond just you being set free. And so they're angry. Jesus is interpreting, he is using this language around Jubilee and release, year of the Lord's favor in many of our English translations, to describe and interpret his entire life. Like his entire life is like, this is Jubilee. Jubilee is here and now. And
which is a pretty audacious claim. Like,
yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. It's not, Jesus isn't being passive in this passage at all. And I think we often focus on the, prophet's not accepted in his hometown. So, when you preach for the first time, don't preach to your home church kind of thing, which is funny because most of us do. Like my first sermon was preached, in my home church where I was a member and then became an elder. And
I worked at my home church for 12 years. So
right.
I got that verse thrown at me.
It's funny how that's the piece that we, we tend to hold on to.
Yeah.
And we make it, in such a typical human way. We put ourselves in the position of Jesus.
Yeah.
And go, all right, well, okay, where's what does this mean? For me to think through my own life, and I go, man, we need to see ourselves as that angry mob, being convicted of the places where we're not living into maybe a spirit or ethic of Jubilee, because that's really at the end of the day what Jesus is saying, and that challenges every single one of us.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to come back to that idea in a moment of, the people that the examples Jesus uses of Elijah and Elisha, and sort of this idea of that, Jesus saving the wrong people.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to go back quickly to kind of wrapping up this conversation around Jubilee, and ask the question of what does an ethic of Jubilee look like today? What could that look like? Well, just holy imagination. How could we see this applied in our world?
Yeah, I think that the early church, in many ways, lived out of this type of ethic. So it's not going to be easy. I think that's the danger when we say, and I don't think you're saying this. I think you would equally say this is going to be really difficult.
Yeah.
I think that the danger in sometimes saying what does it look like for us is we want to simplify it in some way. Like, how can we take this really challenging ethic and make it digestible or easy for us to incorporate into our lives?
Yeah.
And I think that's a danger, because we maybe in some ways have this natural desire to pacify what Jesus calls the church into. Mm-hmm. And so I go back to some of the early church writings through Acts. So we're in Luke now, which is like Acts part 1, early church part 1, and Acts is early church part 2, and see some of the things that they were doing as an early church. There are really challenging ethics to live into. So we see the church embracing the category of individuals that we talked about on Sunday. So the widow, the orphan, the sick, people who would in Jesus's day be considered, quote, outsiders, without social standing. So the language in Luke 4 is poor, and we talked a little bit about how that's not just economically poor, but that is individuals and families, that is communities who were living in such a way because of certain things, whether that is economic or social or medical, like health reasons, illness, who are one day away from starvation, who are subsisting, just what day by day, paycheck to paycheck, maybe doesn't even get there, right? But these are folks who, but for the goodness and generosity of others, are, like I think I read from a quote on Sunday, are one famine away from death or one invasion away from starvation. They're these people who are poor, and not just poor in spirit, but actually unable to.
It's not just a metaphor,
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I see the early church selling possessions and giving to those as there was need, right? And selling land. So, I think the early church embraced this idea of Jubilee. If part of Jubilee was to reset land ownership, and to kind of let go of it for the sake of the community, the early church lived into that ethic, and they sold their land as there was need. The church where I was ordained, there was this story. This was before I got there. But there's a story that really kind of stuck with me. They'd built a new building. So the church had grown, small rural church, had grown to a size of needing to either move into a new building or build, and they built a building and had land that they farmed and really tried to steward the land well. Were really generous in building this new building and gave away money to a partner church so that they could build their building. And there was one family who was, so convinced that this was the right thing to do, not just to build themselves a building, but to do it in a way that released land for farming, to give away food, to support partner church and pay off their building.
That's really cool.
This family sold their cottage. Wow. And gave a large portion of that to, and I don't know how much and what percentage, but that was something that they were convinced and convicted to do. So in a way, like, I think, okay, like that goes beyond tithing. It goes beyond, donation giving. I think that's a Jubilee way to live. It's a generous way to live. And so I see early church doing things like that. Certainly the day-to-day, when the disciples realize, those early apostles, they realize, we need to devote ourselves to prayer and to the teaching of the way of Jesus. They bring in other leaders to make sure that the widows and orphans, the poor, are still receiving food daily, still have what they need. And everything they built out from the very beginning is not just about, we need to spread the, quote, teaching of Jesus by word. We need to actually take care of people as we grow as a community. So I think I see them doing that in the early church in really challenging ways. What does that look like today? I think, without going too far down like very specific ways, I think one of the best things we can do is honestly ask ourselves, what is enough?
Yeah.
And as a individual, as a family, as a household, what is enough? And how am I going to live in a way that generously gives away the rest? That might start to get close. And that's a hard thing to start thinking about.
Hard, yeah.
Right? We think about more and, also have economic realities that we live in, difficult economic realities.
Yeah.
But I think an honest conversation around what is enough is a challenging place to start.
That's a really good question. I'm struck on one example that I think is maybe not as, I'm not sure if this is possible in Canada, but I've heard of churches in the States taking the idea of erasing debts pretty seriously, where they will actually go to like a creditor. They'll raise a bunch of money, like, say $50,000, and they'll go to like a creditor and be like, how much debt can I buy for $50,000? And like, oh, that'll actually buy you, $250,000 worth of someone's debt, and then they'll pay that off. And like, that's a super practical. I have no idea the feasibility of that in Canada, but there's just some fascinating things that the church has been doing, that I've seen and heard about, that kind of gets at this idea of Jubilee. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
And I think just to bring it home for us, as a local church here where we are, I do think that the way we think about and use our land is one of the most important things we can challenge ourselves with in terms of Jubilee ways of life.
Yeah.
So, one of the reasons why Connie and I fell in love with KPC from a distance is the work with the garden and the work with the food bank and to push back sort of the darkness of food insecurity in Guelph. Like that is more than just a start at what it might look like. So, I'd love for us to dream about those ways of living expanding.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So shifting gears slightly. So you quoted N.T. Wright saying, Israel's God was rescuing the wrong people. And I love that. Like, there's something so like beautifully subversive about that. So I want to pose it for today. Who do you see as the wrong people that Jesus is saving today?
Yeah, I feel like this is a dangerous question to answer in a way that's going to live permanently online. So let me answer it this way. I think it's a great question. I think the quote the wrong people, because that's the beauty of the gospel, is that Jesus says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, like it's the sick.
Yeah.
I think anybody who makes me think, yeah, but what about me? Like, that's it.
Yeah.
Like that, if I think about the person who would make you the angriest? And I'm not asking you that question, right?
But I'm thinking about it.
But think about it.
I'm thinking about it.
Who would you have the hardest time forgiving?
Mm-hmm.
Who would you have the hardest time embracing inside the kingdom? And there are jokes about this with denominations and who you're going to see in heaven and what all that talk. I think where the rubber really meets the road for me is who would have the hardest time not embracing in heaven? Who would have the hardest time embracing tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Who would have the hardest time forgiving today? Who would make me the most uncomfortable? And I think that's pretty telling. You can talk about, who's the least like you, or Christians get all bent out of shape about theological divide and division. And we can argue with ourselves far more than, we can do things that probably matter more, or at least we can get sucked into that. I think at the end of the day, the quote, the wrong person is, anybody who makes you the most uncomfortable, anybody who challenges you toward wrestling with forgiveness. Who would you have a hard time? Who would you have a hard time forgiving? And I do where I started, I think, is important. Anybody who makes you think what about me, or woe is me? Because that is exactly what these first listeners are doing. They're like, I thought this was about us.
Yes.
And you're saying it's about them? Mm-hmm. That's backwards. and Jesus says, yep, it is. Mm-hmm. And it's for all those who you would wrestle to welcome in. And I think that's a good place for each of us to wrestle with, who would make you the most uncomfortable. There's other conversations and other talks and commentaries about historical figures who, have done horrible, atrocious things, and to think through what would it be like, for them to be forgiven. And I go, sure, okay, that's maybe dramatic to think about, and I won't name anybody, but dramatic to think about those individuals. I think probably a more challenging thing is this is your neighbor who you can never get along with, right? You're like fighting to cut down a hedge in between, or like their fence is 3 inches on your side, and you know they never shovel their side of the driveway. Whatever it is, this is your neighbor who you don't get along with. This is the person you drive by who you don't see, which is the sad reality maybe of our time. Actually, it might even be the person you don't notice. Yeah. Probably is. So how can we start to think through what a life lived toward those individuals would look like? I think that's equally the Jubilee ethic.
And for those of us who are already followers of Jesus, it is a challenge to help to have God change our hearts, mm-hmm. to allow God to change our hearts, to soften our hearts to those who we would struggle with. You know, they start turning up at our church on Sunday and all of a sudden things look a little different and we got to change how we do things and set aside our preferences and do all these things. Yeah. That it gets uncomfortable. It gets messy. It's, you know, for a lot of people, it messes with our categories, and it's exciting for me as a pastor. It's exciting when I see those things, but I also recognize that it is not It is not easy.
Mm-hmm.
It is not easy. Yeah. Where I've done some, some baptisms over the years for some folks who had quite a past, and who a lot of people would be like, they're getting baptized. They're
Mm-hmm.
Christian,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the scandal and the beauty of the gospel.
Yeah. And we wrestle with it. I think human beings have this tendency to think, but I did all the right thing. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't I deserve? This is the prodigal son,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
this is the parable that Jesus tells of the prodigal son, and I think again, it's interesting to see who we like to read ourselves into in those stories, and you go, yeah, maybe. I mean, and maybe that is your story. Maybe you are the prodigal son, prodigal daughter, prodigal child of God who has a wayward life of rejection that is embraced. I think the reality, like if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, though, you probably have more to learn from the older son, who's like, but I stayed home, I worked, I didn't leave, I've been faithful, and this guy gets the party. Yeah. Right? And the father's response, I love. That parable is a beautiful representation of the gospel. So in the way Jesus tells it, he's like, he hikes up his girds his loin, like he hikes up his clothes, which would have been taking a position of shame, and runs to get to this son, so that he can be the first to embrace him. Because if he's not the first to embrace him, whoever gets to that kid first, if they are involved in the master's household, could exile him, could kick him off the land forever. Wow. Like that's the sort of social implication there. When the prodigal son comes home, if the older son comes, he can say, you're banished for life. You can never come home. Because of how he said, I'll take my inheritance and go. So if anybody except the father gets there first, like the son is done for, there's no chance for reconciliation. The father gets there first and embraces him so that nobody else can banish him, and takes a position of shame in order to do it. And I think the challenge to us that I see in that and in Luke 4 is how am I like the angry older son who's saying, yeah, but I did all the right things and you never threw me a party. And the father goes, yeah, but this guy was dead and now he's alive. Isn't that worth celebrating? And I go, yeah, absolutely it is. Yeah. And it's still hard for us.
It's still hard, but we will get there before long in the book of Luke. So, okay. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about justice and Jesus's, the things that Jesus is talking about in his examples in the Old Testament, in his reading in Isaiah. There are a number of things that he touches on that are important cornerstones of what we would call justice, that there is justice work in what Jesus is describing. And we've talked about the ways in which that intersects with the gospel. But I'd love to explore a little bit about how we approach as a church, as followers of Jesus, how we approach justice. You've already highlighted in our church context some of the things that we do between our food security garden and being a satellite location for the food bank. It's something that's near and dear to my heart, that no one will ever go hungry in our city. That to me is a justice issue that is easy to solve, and it's complex in its own way, but it's in some ways it's just make sure people have food. If people need food, they're going to get food, right? But I am aware that is a passion for me, and that is a passion for many in our church community. But the needs in our city, in our country, in our world are so great. It can feel overwhelming. And I am aware that sometimes when we feel overwhelmed, we just freeze and we don't know what to do. We don't know what causes to give back to, what things to could give our money to, time to, etc. And so I'm wondering if you could take a moment just to encourage people. What's the next step that they could take to see Jubilee come to life, to a more equitable world? What would that look like?
Yeah, this is a great question, a challenging one. It's so easy to get overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Like you turn on the news, you turn on TV during certain seasons, and there's advertising, commercials, and there's it seems like, every organization is pulling on your heart and your soul, your spirit in different directions, and trying to get a piece of the pie, as it were. I think that the best way that I've found to not get overwhelmed by it is to find myself more intentionally rooted in a local community. And I am not saying that you should only be beholden to your immediate family. Or I'm not saying that you should only be beholden to your church. So it's only about let's circle the wagon and protect if you're part of our church, then you get something. And if you're not part of our church, you don't. That is absolutely anti-gospel.
Yes.
However, what I think is practical in terms of not getting overwhelmed is to root your action in a local community. So to stand shoulder to shoulder with a community. There's this picture in Nehemiah where the exiles have come back to Israel, back to Jerusalem. The walls are destroyed and they're rebuilding the walls. And there's this really boring section of Nehemiah where all he does is chronicle the names of the families who rebuilt the wall. And it's this family rebuilt this section, and next to them it was this family, and they rebuilt that section of wall, and next to them this family, and next to them this family. And it reads like a funny genealogy that you're like, why am I reading all these families? But it's this beautiful image of a community standing shoulder to shoulder rebuilding what was broken. And there's a number of reasons why they'd be rebuilding a wall in that era of life. It had everything to do with stability and life and flourishing of life. And so I think the best way to do it is shoulder to shoulder, rooted in a local community. Now, for us, I would consider our church to be that primary local community. And we have work that we do locally, and we have work that we do globally. And we have work that we do on our property, and we have work that we do in our city. I think the number one way that somebody can get overwhelmed is by just starting to look and see all the need that there is and the many different asks or ways in which to start contributing here, there, and everywhere. I think you need a lens through which to start to engage. And I do believe that that's the call of the church. And I think that the church is acting as the church when it is living out its the gospel of Jesus. It's living out its gospel mandate to work to see the people who are hungry have food. And Jesus's list, right, of release from for the poor, release from illness and sickness, release from these things that are inspiring. So root your action in a local community that is engaged locally and globally. I'm not just saying give all your money to the church, but a local community is going to help you start to see where things can begin for you. And this is the other thing. It's a way in which you can become immediately involved in doing something.
Yeah.
I think that's the danger when we are overwhelmed, is that we do nothing. And then we feel bad about doing nothing. And then there's guilt and shame, and there's so much need out there, and I'm so overwhelmed by it. I can't do anything. I'm not going to do anything. And then you feel bad. for not doing anything. And then you see all the needs. You're like, I'm going to see what there is. And it's this, you can end up in this weird shame, guilt sort of, depressive,
vicious cycle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so it is community that breaks you out of that and says, take one step. And that's why I think our partnerships, our mission partnerships, are so crucial.
Yeah. That's great. And there is wisdom in ensuring that the things that you are wanting to place your energy and money into are done with wisdom and thoughtfulness and that we're not doing something that is going to be harmful rather than helpful. There's lots of good material about that. But I do think that, when we do this in a community, we're going to be stronger. We're going to make more impact when we do it together. And there's this embodied thing that happens when we get together and we're all working toward it. It's just it's a remarkable thing. I've seen it when we are, working in the garden and you get a bunch of people out volunteering and harvesting and giving away. And it's this beautiful picture.
So the last thing that I would say really quickly about that is it brings accountability to you just not choosing only the organizations or causes that you like. Right. So like I might not be, I like being outside and working in a garden sounds great, especially when we're buried under however many feet of snow we are right now. But, that might not be everybody's cup of tea. And it's certainly, like I'll say for my family, like Connie is way more wired to be in the garden, harvesting food and figuring out how to plant things like in an ethical way that helps nourish the land as opposed to just taking from the land. Like she is far more wired for that than I am. And I need that because I need to be reminded of, like, sometimes I just have to go outside and dig in the dirt. And, I think the danger when you start supporting organizations, as good as they will be, is that you will naturally have a bias toward the causes that you like or that you want to support. And sometimes those aren't the causes that are in most need. Sometimes those aren't the ones that will challenge you the most in your own growth as a follower of Jesus. And so sometimes you need to be reminded that it's necessary to be uncomfortable and to work in ways that cause discomfort and not just to throw your money at things that you like from a distance. Again, as good as supporting financially organizations is, but I think we would be naturally biased toward certain organizations and not others. So we need community to say, actually, here's a more holistic image of what it could be like. For the same reason that we're preaching through the book of Luke, as opposed to me just saying we're going to do this passage and then this passage and then this passage, because that is only going to be the ones that I like to preach. And we need to hit the ones that are awkward and uncomfortable and really challenging and hard to get through. Yeah.
It's going to be great.
Yeah. And so in the same way, the church helps you do that with your money and with your time, with your energy, with how you're serving a community.
Yeah. I think it's great to be in conversation about those things as a community. I had so many other questions that we don't have time for. It almost feels like we need to do like a bonus episode or something like that, just so I can pick your brain on some things. But I think that's probably a great place to leave things for today. So
yeah, we would love to hear some of the thoughts that you have or questions that you have coming out of these episodes and sermons. And so in future weeks, we'll have easy ways for you to do that. But we do hope that our conversation has helped you still continue to wrestle through this text. And listen, like our biggest hope, I think, is that as a community, we become more and more engaged with the things of, in this language, Jubilee, the things of Jesus in our community. So we do hope you have a good week. We hope that you're challenged in some way to live out the life of Jesus in your family, your home, your work, and into the week ahead. But thanks for spending some time with us today.